Hello, everybody. I'm Michael Oppenheimer from the Princeton Environmental Institute, and I'm here to introduce our guest tonight, Bill McKibben, who'll be speaking about art, activism, and the chance for change. Before I introduce Bill, let me say that his visit is jointly hosted by the Princeton Environmental Institute and the Princeton University Art Museum in connection with the upcoming exhibition, Nature's Nation, American Art and Environment. Two other related events are a conversation with Naomi Klein in Makash 50 on November 15th, and a Princeton faculty panel on November 30th that will examine environmental issues against the backdrop of selected works from Nature's Nation. I'll also note that we'll be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Princeton Environmental Institute early next year. When The Daily Show was just getting going some years ago, Jon Stewart emceed a fundraising event for an environmental group that I happened to attend. And one of his biggest laugh lines of the night was a comment that I can paraphrase as, "Environmentalists don't have a sense of humor." Maybe they do. The remarks seem to reflect a general view that environmentalists, and of course I'm an environmentalist, haven't learned how to deliver bad news without becoming tedious, or how to create a vision of a sustainable planet without becoming overbearing and preachy, or mobilize people to confront gigantic issues like climate change without paralyzing most of them with fear, leading people to just tune out. Bill McKibben may be the only exception. He may be the only one who's broken the mold. Author of, author of The End of Nature, the first book on climate change to reach the general public, a founder of 350.org, the first ongoing and genuinely grassroots effort to tackle this issue, Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College, and a winner of many awards, including the Gandhi Peace Prize. Bill's legacy, still in the making, I hope, is energizing people. Among his cornucopia of writing on the subject, my favorite is a 2012 article in Rolling Stone, which I recommend to all of you, called Global Warming's Terrifying New Math, 3 simple numbers that add up to global catastrophe and make clear who the real enemy is. This article made the relationship between dangerous levels of warming, annual carbon dioxide emissions, and the size of the remaining fossil fuel reserves crystal clear. It is basically an advanced version of the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was issued earlier this month, but written for the layperson and published 6 years earlier. Bill's approach to environmental progress might be contrasted with that of my former boss. I used to work at the Environmental Defense Fund, Fred Krupp, who spoke here last year, and who has long pursued strategies that are sometimes characterized as the ultimate inside game. Bill does the opposite, so it's noteworthy that the last time I discussed Bill's work with Fred, he called Bill a genius. Bill's website highlights the fact that a woodland gnat, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, Megathalamidia McKibbeni, was named in his honor. I have a toad named in my honor, by the way. I don't know which is worse. I'm sure the metaphor of a bothersome creature that won't leave us alone, no matter how many swats at it we take, must have been in the minds of those who chose the name. But if that was the point, the metaphor is inappropriate. Plenty of people make annoying buzzes these days, but they don't make a difference. Bill McKibben has made a huge difference, at very least by inspiring millions to get engaged and not give up hope. Please join me in welcoming Bill McKibben.
Well, many thanks. Brother Oppenheimer, many thanks. In any food chain, the toad is well above the gnat, and that's appropriate in this case. Much honor due you for many decades of hard work in these vineyards, and we're all the better for it. Thank you so much. It is an enormous honor for me to get to be here because of this remarkable show. that we've just been touring. If you haven't been able to see it yet, you must get over to the museum and take a look at it. It's quite remarkable. Think of me mostly today as A, your encourager to get to the museum, and B, as the warm-up act for Naomi Klein, who will be here in mid-November. She and her husband, Avi Lewis, were my chauffeurs today, and I'm very grateful to both of you, as always. Two of our greatest leaders in the environmental fight all over the world, so thanks to you guys, too. Now, I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and then we'll do some questions. Yes, Michael, that's the plan. And when I was walking around the show, one of the things, I'm sure, Alan, that I was thinking of was a slightly analogous task I had some years ago for the Library of America of editing this great doorstop of a book, a literary anthology of American writing about the environment since Thoreau. And of course, the hardest part of that kind of task, and I'm sure of the task of curating this exhibit, was not figuring out what to put in, it was figuring out what to leave out, and just there's sort of great pain involved in that, because there is such a plethora of, and such a moment to be trying to make sense of it all. Right now, obviously, we are grappling with America's history in all kinds of new ways. Academic historians, of course, are hard about this task. Anybody who hasn't had a chance to read Jill Lepore's new book should be at it as soon as you possibly can. But environmental historians, too, and art historians, different stories are coming to the forefront. The theft of a continent, the prosperity built on the backs of people who had no say. It all begins to look different in our minds, even maybe especially in retrospect. We were looking today at the marvelous prints of Ansel Adams of Half Dome in Yosemite. But I was looking last week at the great work of the young photographer David Benjamin Sherry, who's taken many of his images and just drenched them in saturated color of various kinds, just to kind of force one to take a step back and look at it in a new light, interrupting the easy and romantic flow of our sort of narrative about who we are in relation to this country. I do think that America's great contribution to the world of letters, and in some ways to visual arts as well, may rest in the fact that we were already artistically conscious when we set about the task of destroying the world around us. That process had already happened deep in the mists of time in China or in Europe, and so wasn't chronicled in the same way. But here we were making books and paintings, even as we took down the great forests and dammed the waterfalls. And so we've wrestled all along with in useful ways with what that means. And that wrestling is going on still, and it's why this exhibit is so remarkable. Now, I will say that even though I remain in certain ways a romantic myself about the American landscape, in fact, a romantic somewhat precisely of the Hudson River School, having spent much of my life living on the headwaters of the Hudson in the Adirondacks. I can take you, if you have a day and a sturdy pair of boots, to the spot near Blue Ledges where Winslow Homer painted the waterfall gushing into the Hudson. Wilderness, for all its erasures, is one of America's greatest contributions to the world. Conservation, for all its contradictions, should be one of our proudest boasts. And the visual arts, perhaps painting, photography above all, have been utterly essential in the effort to preserve and conserve some of that world, in that effort. I mean, the daguerreotypes that began emerging from the Adirondacks in the 1860s and 70s, showing the destruction of that forest primeval, or as we thought at the time, were really the first images like that hit the American eye. And it was no accident that the Adirondacks became the first real site of conservation in the world, when we drew the blue line around this vast eastern wilderness and set it aside. You'll see some of those images in the galleries, and they're extraordinarily powerful. But that power is continued on into the present, or on into the modern era. I mean, we speak rightly of Rachel Carson's heroic efforts in the early 1960s. We call them the kind of birth of modern environmentalism, which is true. But roughly at the same time, David Brower, the longtime head of the Sierra Club, was doing something probably equally as politically significant. He was devoting a great deal of his time and a great deal of the Sierra Club's money, more than the board wanted, to producing a series of coffee table books filled with photos that landed on the coffee tables of an extraordinary number of Americans. Those pictures by Ansel Adams, by Elliot Porter, many others, changed the way that Americans looked at the world, helped Americans rediscover or discover for the first time the idea of wilderness, fall in love with vast swaths of the American continent. Some of those pictures look modest enough now to our kind of IMAX-trained eye. Elliot Porter seems kind of small and subtle, but they were deep revelations, and without them, I very much doubt we would ever have had the Wilderness Act, the most poetic that Congress has ever gotten. 1964 defined wilderness as, in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, such places, Congress said, are hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Try to imagine that we actually had a representative body in this country capable of thinking even in those terms, and not in the lifetime of people in this room. Now, of course, that's an empty boast, the idea of a place untrammeled by man. There is no place anymore untrammeled by man. Michael, when I wrote The End of Nature in 1989, that was, along with the sort of being the first book about the science of climate change, that was kind of the message, that we'd managed by changing the temperature of every place on Earth to change its meaning. Thoreau had once boasted that he could walk half an hour from his home and come to a place where no man stands from one year's end to another, and there, consequently, politics is not, for politics is but the cigar smoke of a man. No matter how far you go in this world now, you can't escape its politics. They register in every cubic meter of our air, in every drop of our ocean, in everything going on around us. We are in a fight of immense proportions now, the greatest fight that humans have yet undertaken, and a fight that we are losing badly. The IPCC report from 2 weeks ago, the latest in a string of really 6 now major IPCC reports that all have told us the same thing, more or less, since the mid-1990s, making it abundantly clear our peril. And every day, those scientific warnings are ratified with some new record flood or drought or heat wave. Today, it's the people of the Marianas Islands in the Pacific that we should be thinking of. Typhoon U2 came through yesterday with speeds above 180 miles an hour, the 5th heaviest hurricane ever felt on the planet. 7 of the 10 strongest storms in recorded history have now occurred since 2006. That's the hot new world that we're increasingly inhabiting. It's a fight that, if we have any chance of winning it, is going to demand powerful new levels of human solidarity. When you look at the migrant caravan approaching us from the south, do not think, I don't think of our peril or the danger that it seems to me to represent no danger save the danger that the people fleeing those places are fleeing. In part, the violence that's consumed those countries. in no small part because they've suffered, among other things, from just epic drought in recent years that's made it extremely hard for people to do what needs doing. By now, that's a familiar story. Academics credit much of the flight of millions of people from Syria to the drought, the deepest drought we've ever seen in what we once called the Fertile Crescent, that helped trigger the Civil War, that has helped create chaos across the politics of the Western world. It's a fight that demands not just solidarity, it's a fight that demands enormous economic change. Naomi Klein has written better about that than anybody else on the planet. There are reminders of that too every day. Yesterday, the Attorney General of the state of New York announced that the state of New York was filing suit against Exxon for the deceit and fraud that had accompanied its 30-year campaign of obfuscation about climate change. One hopes that these companies will be held accountable and in some small way begin the work of repaying the damage that has happened as a result of that obfuscation. It's a fight that's being met with stunning backlash. Even as we try and get someplace new, the fossil fuel industry and its forces are undergirding much of the, it's impossible to imagine, say, Donald Trump's election without some of this pushback against perceived new threats. It's impossible to imagine the impending election of the Brazilian tyrant Bolsonaro without picturing what it's going to do to the last great remaining forests of the Amazon, on which our climate, among other things, is utterly dependent. And so it is a fight that demands all the resources that we can bring to it, and this will sound a little odd, but I think it's true, of those resources, art may be among the most potent and most important. Because winning the argument clearly is not enough. Michael and his colleagues in the hard sciences won the argument in the 1990s. By the mid-1990s, there was a broad scientific consensus about what was happening, about the threat that it represented, about what to do about it, about how it would play out. Nothing at the core of that message has changed over the last 30 years. We knew what was going on, and there's no argument against it. Having won the argument's not enough. We have to win the fight. And the fight, as fights always are, is about money and power. And we don't have the money not to fight with the fossil fuel industry. And we don't have the guns not to fight with the likes of the people, some of them running the world at the moment. We do have solidarity. We do have the redemptive power of nonviolence. And we do have a vision. And art is one of the most important ways of getting that vision across. I've thought this for a long time. Probably 15 years ago, I wrote an online blog post for a magazine called Grist. And I asked the question, where is the art about climate change? All the other crises that we face, say the AIDS crisis or things, have produced epic works of art. Why not this one? Be careful what you wish for. Immediately upon publishing it, every bad poet in America sent me their poem about climate change. In fact, I think it's understandable why we didn't have that art for a while. It's because so much of human history was taken up with the conflict between humans and other humans. That's where most of our theological resources lie. That's where so much of our because those were the grip. Nature was the background for our activities, and that nature had become the foreground, and that the conflict between human beings and the physical world that took a while to sink in, but it has sunk in. And now we see movies and operas and paintings. And that's a very good sign, because these things help with what we need more than anything else. Not a shift in laws as much as a shift in zeitgeist that will precede the laws that need to come and the economic shifts that need to come. The technologists have given us the tools, the solar panel, the windmill, that we need to get off fossil fuel, but now we need the will to put those things in place at a speed that has some hope of catching up with physics. And of the sources of will, that art is high on the list. In fact, given the time we have, or rather, given the time we don't have, because the most important thing about this last IPCC report was that it managed to get across finally, I think, to the public imagination, the idea that time is very, very limited. If we don't solve this problem soon, we will not solve it. That's the basic truth. Given that, I'm going to make the argument today that we need, at least some artists, some of the time, to be not just in sympathy with this broader movement, but in collaboration with it, working with it in ways that help it build the power that it needs at the speed that it needs. Let's think for a minute about the iconography of our age, about the things that we literally could not picture until quite recently. These are pictures taken in the lifetime of some of the people in this room, and they were the most remarkable pictures that human beings had ever seen. The first images from Apollo back at this world around us. And they allowed us, of course, to see things that we hadn't seen before, to really understand, as everyone remarked at the time, that there were no national boundaries evident from space, that it was a lonely blue marble floating in a black void, that it was a place of unique beauty, but also of obvious fragility. Those messages should have sunk in and should have gotten us to work hard. They weren't yet quite enough. And so we see now more dire images from space. That's what's happening up north. The yellow line is where ice used to be in the summer Arctic. The world looks remarkably different than it did 50 years ago, viewed from outer space. It's increasingly a different planet. On that planet, we're now able to see spectacular and horrifying images of the power that we have unleashed. There's Maria sweeping across Puerto Rico with a fury like we've never seen before, and one that we don't even really know how to cope with. Not technologically, trying to rebuild it's been an amazing task, but especially not politically. How on earth it is that we've managed to neglect our countrymen in Puerto Rico is one of the most shameful stories of the recent American past, and it's in competition, obviously, with a lot of other shameful stories. There's the great ice sheets. I mean, until quite recently in the satellite era, we had no way of knowing what was going on down there, but now we know, and to watch those disappear day by day is both fascinating and depressing. These are images that David Brashears, the great mountaineer and photographer, brought back from the Himalayas. He went to recreated the pictures of the Mallory expedition in the 1920s, climbed at great risk and effort to precisely the same places to take the same images to demonstrate just how much had been lost. That red line is where the ice was in 1921. That's about the height of the Statue of Liberty that's missing there in ice on that glacier and virtually every other large glacier in the world. We used to, 30 years ago, speak fairly abstractly about climate change because it was yet hard to picture its actual devastation, but now the pictures are so numerous and come rushing in so fast that they're almost impossible to take in. These are villages in Alaska, native villages that are having to be evacuated because without ice there in the ocean, now without the sea ice that's always been there, the wave action is destroying and eroding the beaches on which people depend. And so these places are no longer viable. The cost of moving people from these villages has been about $1 million per person. So do that calculation times the number of people that are going to have to move as the sea rises around this planet. And I know Michael is working hard on the next IPCC report on sea level. Multiply those by 1 million or even some small fraction of it, and you begin to understand what the economic and human cost that we're undertaking is. These are the great coral reefs of the world. The IPCC report that came out last week said that if we raise the temperature 1.5 degrees, we'll lose 70% of the world's corals to 90%. If we let it go to 2 degrees, we'll lose 99%. Basically, we're managing to wipe out, in the course of a human lifetime, one of the most beautiful and rich and diverse ecosystems on the earth. We're managing to scrape out one of the most beautiful corners of God's brain, and those images should haunt us. I think. So, how do we fight back? These are a few images from Greenland in August. I went there. I'd organized an expedition that I'd been wanting to do for quite a while, a kind of odd expedition, I must say. Greenland is spectacularly beautiful and changing spectacularly fast as its ice melts. In fact, we were on a boat. I don't know if you can see this or not. We were on a boat, and you can see that it's all open water for many miles around us, but looking at the chart above the captain's wheel, you can see the icon for our craft makes it clear that we're on solid land. I pointed this out to the captain, and the captain smiled at me and said, yes, the chart is 5 years old. All of that was ice 5 years ago, as far as you can see, and now it's all water, as far as you can see. Maybe we'll let this play as I talk for a minute, and this is just a picture I took with my cell phone out the front of a helicopter. And it has a payoff in a minute. Let me tell you, as I'm showing it, what we were doing there. This was a poetry expedition. There was a young woman who I've long admired, a poet from the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands are one of the most low-lying atolls in the Pacific. You may remember it because we managed to destroy a good portion of it by blowing up Bikini Atoll in one of the H-bomb tests, okay? That ice, by the way, is 120 feet tall at the end of the glacier there, so about a 12-story building. I wanted to take her there to the ice to do one of her poems standing up on the ice that when it melted would drown her home. I figured that that might be one way to kind of try and get across viscerally to people what was going on. She recruited a young Greenlandic native poet, a woman named Akka Niviana, because her way of life is disappearing beneath her feet as Greenland melts and as many of the villages along its edge become more and more difficult to inhabit. Just to give you, this image now is just to give you a sense to have in your mind, okay, of what is going on around the planet now every minute of every day. We just happen to be there flying over this particular chunk of ice at the moment that it decided to let go, and a piece of ice far bigger than this building we're in now, okay? I'm opening the window to get a better picture. I'm no great photographer, but keep those 40-foot waves in mind the next time you think about sea level rise, just to give you a kind of sense of what it is that's happening now every second around the world. It's extraordinarily beautiful in its way, and it is our world, and we should look about it and think about it. But those are the poets, and you can see the results of there's about a 6-minute video that they did, and if you go just Google Greenland poem, I think it's the first thing that'll come up because millions of people have watched it now. It's powerful, and it is angry, and it is also in solidarity and hopeful. At 350.org, we've organized about 20,000 demonstrations around the world in every country except North Korea over the last 10 years. Almost all done by volunteers everywhere. And each of them in its way is a kind of art project in and of itself. Many, many have just taken thousands of people and spelled out images, or even just spelled out the number 350 for 350 parts per million CO2 against a wide variety of backdrops, natural and human. It's been amazing. But sometimes we've tried very consciously to use art in our work. There was a day when we had what the papers described as the biggest art project in the planet's history. We had to borrow a bunch of airplanes and then satellites to get these images because they were so large. Tom York of Radiohead there had assembled several thousand of his close friends and given them raincoats, blue raincoats, so that they could make that image. Those of you with a good classical education will recognize the image of King Canute trying in vain to hold back the rising seas. That was an image with thousands of people in the DR, an image that's all too common now in our iconography. People having to flee through the roof of a building as it floods from the bottom stories. That scarab beetle is pushing solar panels across the Egyptian desert. That's a great polar bear on the Iceland glacier. That was maybe my favorite. Friends of ours at the Santa Fe Art Institute organized it, and at the precise, this is one of these dry arroyos, or now dried out rivers in the Southwest. At the precise moment that the satellite came over, 3,000 people put blue blankets up overhead just for a second to bring that river back to life. Those kind of things are extraordinarily important. There are other kinds of art that are just as key, and things we don't necessarily think of exactly as art, but in a sense are. Civil disobedience works as an increasing part of this effort, in part because of the images that it produces. Some of you will remember the remarkable stand at Standing Rock on the Sioux Reservation 3 years ago now in the effort to stop 2 years ago now, in an effort to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline coming through that territory. I knew that that fight was going to be powerful and successful the day that the images came back of people, Native Americans, sitting peacefully as oil company guards put snarling German shepherds on them, attacked them with dogs. And the reason that I knew it would be so powerful, and the reason that I forwarded those pictures that instant to the White House, was because I knew that they would recall the iconography of the Civil Rights Movement. Save for color versus black and white, they were the same image as the dogs at Birmingham attacking school children. And indeed, the White House and many other people responded to those images. Barack Obama, somewhat to our surprise, put the kibosh on that Dakota Access Pipeline, and it would not have been built had Donald Trump not won the election some weeks later. It was an enormously powerful set of images, and just one of millions that emerged from the amazing organizing that Indigenous people were doing on the ground there in the Dakotas. This is one of the great and epic stands of our time. 350's role, one of the things that we did there to try and help and support that I was really pleased of was that we were helped build right at the beginning of the encampment there at Standing Rock, a tent whose only purpose was to produce art. It had the silk screens and things that were necessary to be churning out images one after another. And so those images became known across the country. They were the face, in a way, of that fight. And I show them to you because you need to go look at the exhibit here to see some of the amazing artifacts from 150, 175 years ago from that reservation, and some of the artifacts from this fight 2 years ago. This is at the heart of American conservation, American environmentalism, of global consciousness. This should be one of the great lessons, visual, scientific, political, of our time. A few weeks ago in San Francisco, we had the biggest. We had a day around the world with about 900 rallies in many places, 50,000 people in Paris, 35,000 people in Kampala, Uganda, all kind of trying to bring attention to the IPCC report and the effort in California to assemble the world's cities and states to try and reach some kind of post-Paris attempt to continue the momentum towards an energy transition. We had tens of thousands of people marching in the streets of San Francisco, but when they got to San Francisco City Hall, one of the things that we did was have what became the biggest street mural in history, people from many different communities painting these remarkable images that dominated the streetscape of San Francisco, and you can see people at work on them there. They were extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily powerful for the people who saw them, but as much for the people who were painting them. It became a way of really sort of trying to turn that energy of protest inward a little. It was a remarkable thing to watch and to participate in. I think that Rebecca Solnit was here as part of this conversation at some point, the great essayist and writer. Her brother, David Solnit, is 350's artist in residence, and he was responsible for coordinating all this work, a remarkable human being. Michael, I'm running over, so I'm going to show just one or two more images here, just to make a point about iconography that I think is important. These pictures they're a couple of years old, and they're from our crew of remarkable activists on these low-lying islands of the Pacific. The Marshalls, Micronesia, the Solomons, Vanuatu, Tuvalu, places like that. Places that, many of them that may not exist past this century. Places with thousands and thousands of years of human history, places that have done literally nothing to cause the problem that imperils them, places where people have taken as their slogan, "We're not drowning, we're fighting." And one of the ways in which they were fighting most creatively was to build on each island, this is in Tokelau, one traditional canoe, traditional design, and then take them all to Newcastle in Australia, which is the largest coal port in the world, and there use them to blockade for a day the biggest ore ships in the world as they came out of the harbor. Now, I show you those pictures because I want to make the point that there are certain tropes that just kind of click in the human mind. And of those tropes, maybe almost the simplest and most powerful is the many and the small against the big and powerful and few, okay? This is the Rebel Alliance versus the Death Star, okay? And that's how to understand it, and that's, if we're going to get out of this, how we're going to have to act. And that image struck me so hard because just the same autumn, and by the way, those had enormous effect. The city of Newcastle, biggest coal port in the world, voted a few months later to divest its pension funds from fossil fuel. Think about that for a minute, and then ask yourself why Princeton University, one of the richest institutions on planet Earth, hasn't yet seen fit to divest its endowment from fossil fuel. Okay? And many thanks to all you who are fighting to make that happen. We were in New York City last night for a big celebration of the fact that New York City divested its $200 billion pension fund in January. I look forward to the party here when that happens in the future. But I show you that picture just because I see it now. Once you have some kind of iconic image in your mind, you see it repeating place after place after place. And so here's an image, and I think it's the one I'll leave you with, the same year from the harbor in Seattle. And that 40-story monolith there is the drilling rig that Shell Oil wanted to use to go prospecting for oil in the Arctic, the first attempt to take the American Arctic and drill for oil. So think about that for a minute, okay? Scientists like Dr. Oppenheimer had been telling people for 30 years that if we kept doing what we were doing, the Arctic was going to melt. Then we kept doing what we were doing, and the Arctic melted. Did Shell Oil look at that and say, maybe we should perhaps think about going into a different line of business like solar panels or something? They did not. They looked at that and said, now it'll be easier to drill for yet more oil in the Arctic. Okay? There's a moment at which one begins to wonder whether the big brain was a good evolutionary adaptation or not. And that's one of them. Happily, there were lots of people with perfectly good brains and large hearts attached to them who got in the way. Thousands of people took to the water in small craft. We called them kayaktivists. And they so shamed Shell that by the end of the summer, Shell had decided that the hit to its brand reputation was not worth it, and pulled out, having spent $9 billion to prospect in the Arctic, pulled out. That was a tremendous victory. We need many, many, many more of those victories going forward. I don't know if any of this will be enough to win this fight. We are a mile behind in this fight. I do know that we're leaving behind a visual record of that fight, which is important on its own terms. And I know that we need more artists willing to be part of that fight, and to some degree on the terms of the movements that are fighting. Not to prescribe what to picture, but to make images that are of use to movements. It needn't be all that anyone does, but it should be a part. It's a sacrifice for artists. All of us who are artists or writers would rather follow our own impulses entirely, and sometimes we must and should. That's what being an artist means. But everyone, including artists, is also called to citizenship and solidarity, okay? We cannot win this battle as individuals. It is pointless to try one person at a time to win this fight. My house is covered with solar panels, but I do not try to fool myself that that's how we're going to stop global warming. If we stop it, it will be because individuals manage to become a little bit less individual and join together in the movements of a size and power large enough to stand up to the enormous forces, the ones that I've been trying to picture, that are currently overwhelming us. That's a role for all of us to play in one way or another, and it's a role for artists in particular because they have such power to try and figure out how they can take on in a very special way. Thank you all very much.
Great.
All right.
So we have time for about 15 or 20 minutes of questions. Bill will take his own questions. And we have mics circulating in the audience, so just raise your hand and Bill will be happy to answer.
I'll do my best to see. Up there.
Wait till the microphone comes.
I still can't see where that is.
Okay.
Do we have sufficient technology to replace oil and gas? 10 years ago, the honest answer to that, I think, would have been not yet. The last 10 years, the real epic achievement has come not from politicians who've done virtually nothing. It's come from engineers who've done a great deal. The price of a solar panel has fallen roughly 90% in that period. And in the same period, in the last 4 or 5 years, the price of storage for that electricity, batteries, is now on the same kind of rapid curve. Wind power, too. These are actually, in most of the world now, the cheapest way to generate electrons. What does that mean? That means that if we really wanted to make the all-out effort to do this, and it would be an all-out effort comparable to what we had to do when we got into World War II, changing our industrial makeup to really prioritize the things that needed making. If we really wanted to, we could make that transition in time enough to matter. We are going to make it. 75 years from now, the world's going to run on sun and wind because free is a hard business proposition to argue with past a certain point, okay? But if it takes us anything like 75 years to get there, the world that we power with sun and wind will be a broken world. Our job is to make this happen very fast so that we begin to catch up to one degree or another with the physics of climate change. At this point, we also have to do the work of removing carbon from the atmosphere somehow. Changes in the way that we use land, forestry. These are topics that Michael is far better on than most people in the world. So, but I think the basic answer to your question is, yup, if we really wanted to get down to it, technology is not the obstacle. The obstacle above all is the political power of the fossil fuel industry, which has proven itself willing to try and preserve its business model for another 10, 20, 30 years, even now at the obvious cost of breaking the planet.
Wait a second.
Here comes the microphone. They're converging from all sides.
Do you believe there should be some type of, for lack of a better word, like a sin tax, same as what we have on cigarettes or alcohol on meat? Because we know at this point the damaging effects of eating meat. So if people continue to consciously make this decision to support the meat industry, don't you think there should be some type?
Should there be, the question is, should there be some kind of tax on meat?
Yeah, to make it so much more expensive that it's less.
So you could do that. You could probably as efficiently put some kind of tax on carbon in general. And since factory farmed meat is basically an exercise in the vast quantity of fossil fuels, you'd capture that and you'd capture the 80% or 85% of emissions that come from other things too. Yeah, there should be let's broaden the question. There should definitely be a tax on carbon. There's no good reason to let people pour carbon into the atmosphere for free. We don't do that for anything else. I mean, you know, everybody else has to clean up after themselves. It's only the fossil fuel industry that gets a free pass. And in that case, big ag is a kind of subdivision of the fossil fuel industry. At this point, I think that's no longer enough to come close to dealing by itself with the scale of the problem. Having written the first book about this 30 years ago, and I have a feeling, Michael, this may be a problem you have too, sometimes I have to restrain myself from saying, oh, if only you'd listened to me then. Because 30 years ago, a gentle, modest tax on carbon would have been more than sufficient to set us on a different trajectory. We would not have solved this problem by now because it's a big problem, but we would have broken the back, I think, of this problem. We'd be moving now in the right direction, just as with the ozone layer, we're watching it slowly heal one season to the next. Now that we've waited this long, the possibilities for gentle trajectories are gone. We've gone from the bunny slope at the ski area to the double black diamond if we're going to have any chance of getting down this thing. And so we need to put a price on carbon, but we need probably even more importantly at this point to be politically serious about keeping carbon in the ground, about making sure that we no longer mine or drill this stuff, about not building any new fossil fuel infrastructure, about providing extensive support for the rapid build-out of renewable energy. There's 4 or 5 things on that list that are crucial, I think, at this point. That's a good question. Thank you. Here comes the microphone. You guys are all, you're very smart, but you're not picking up quickly on the whole microphone thing.
Taking off on the idea of the artistic vision. Artistic vision is to help us see things that we can't see readily with our own eyes. And one of those things that it helps people see is the future. And the trouble is that we have a competing vision for the future that many people in our political establishment have well built into their mindsets from childhood that has to do with a religious paradigm. And without trying to step on religious freedom and demean other people's beliefs as beliefs, can't we get a little more aggressive in the scientific community about forcing our political leaders to deal in their use of their power as politicians only with established facts that are based upon objective evidence and not upon subliminal notions of their beliefs in a supernatural afterlife, salvation?
I think in answer to your question, there's no way to force politicians to think about a particular set of things.
But in other words, discussing that
But
directly, because I think until we address the fact that many politicians honestly believe this is not man-made, not because there's no evidence, but because they believe nothing this large by definition cannot be somehow sanctioned by a divine force, and that's the wall we're hitting.
So the good news is, on this regard, I mean, you're obviously right. There are plenty of politicians and plenty of theologies that make this much more difficult. There are also plenty of theologies that make it much easier. Many of the people in the forefront of this fight around the world, including people that you saw pictured there, are people of deep faith. That camp at Standing Rock was absolutely saturated with prayer. That was the people who led the camp at Standing Rock identified prayer as their main reason for being there. Okay, and in that they are not alone. The great companion document to the IPCC reports is Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si. I reviewed it for the New York Review of Books, so I spent several weeks kind of deep engagement with it. It is a powerful, powerful critique of where we are from the single, the faith leader on the planet with the single largest congregation. And it's way more radical than anything that comes out of the Princeton Environmental Institute or any other place on it. I mean, it's a thoroughgoing critique of who we are and where we are and how we are. So I actually think it's going to take a combination of good-hearted people of all kinds willing to stand up and make this case. And I find myself at least as at least as hopeful of faith communities as allies as I do of almost any other community going forward.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
I met a lot of politicians and so-called leaders in my life, including a few good ones. And I've had a lot of conversations with them about climate change. And I sincerely believe that almost none of them disbelieve the science in the privacy of their own head. They know what's going on, they are aware of it. They either are hypocritical and chicken-hearted, or they just don't have, and they basically just don't have the willpower to exert the leadership. Real political leadership could make a big difference on this issue. People don't want to see this problem continue by and large.
That's a good point.
Please discuss the interrelationship of environmental degradation, meat consumption, and the practices of factory farming.
Sure. The question's about the interrelationship of factory farming and greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. This is a big part of the problem for several reasons. I mean, some of them obvious. Cows produce a lot of methane in the course of a day. And factory farming, which is essentially pouring oil on cornfields to produce huge amounts of corn that we feed to cattle that we then slaughter and pack. I mean, that growing all of that takes a lot of energy. And maybe most consequentially, we continue to cut down enormous amounts of productive rainforest in order to. So we think, the latest estimates I've seen are that agriculture accounts for roughly 18%.
A little more than that, taken as a whole.
18, 20, some percentage around that of emissions. So it's a big part of the problem. The reason I think that we tend to concentrate at we've taken it our brief at 350 to really take on the fossil fuel industry. And there's two reasons for that. One, it's much the larger share of emissions. And two, though extremely powerful, the fossil fuel industry at least has the advantage of presenting a manageable number of targets. There's 70 or 80 companies that are engaged in it, in essence. And we at least can identify them and know who they are. There's big gains to be made in agriculture, and people are starting to make them. The problem from an organizing point of view is there's a couple of billion farmers on the planet, and many of them have been, to sort of change those scale of practices and things is daunting. And I think that's probably why there's been less activism around it. But as people do it, we'll do our best to help them, point them in the right direction, cheer them on. I can tell you that at 350.org we have, and Naomi can tell you this too because she's on the board, we have a staff of 100 people scattered around the planet, all of them younger than Naomi and me. That's the largest organization in the world whose full-time job is fighting climate change. That should give you some pause, okay? Make you a little nervous. I know it does me. And it should also give you a little pause in finding new tasks for us to do, because we've got enough. So people should definitely build movements, and we'll give them all the help and advice we can.
Let's look to the other side
Yes.
of the room.
Why don't you pick for a while, because I'm having trouble
There's one
seeing.
there. In the beret. Yeah.
You've basically said that solar and wind power are their future. What is your understanding of a change in the political climate that would allow a government organization like SERI to be reinstated?
SERI is
Solar Energy Research
the Research
Institute, used to be
the
in
arm of
Golden,
NREL.
Colorado.
Look, in American, let me try to answer that in this way. I'm very happy to be here at Princeton. I'm on the road tomorrow to Pennsylvania to campaign for Jess King for Congress, on the way to Maryland to campaign the day after that, on the way to Nebraska to campaign the day after that. If we don't win some damn elections in this country, then we're never going to have, the federal government's not going to do a darn thing about any of this. It's at the moment firmly in the grip of the fossil fuel industry. That's who runs the show, okay? If you want that to change, then you have to change the composition of the government. That the answer is as simple as it is difficult to get underway. If we have different people running things, we'll have different priorities. Having said that, I'll say quite frankly that I'm not convinced at this point that it's going to be mostly that movements' only target needs to be governments and politicians. I have a feeling that process is slower now than we may be able to, than the physics of this may cope with. We're going to have to spend a lot of time going after the financial institutions that provide. Money is the oxygen on which the fires of global warming burn, and if we can figure out how to cut off some of that money at Wall Street and the insurance industry through pension funds, all that, then we may be able to exert some leverage, we'll see. But in America, in the autumn, on even-numbered years, the highest point of leverage in the next 2 weeks is voting. If it's completely clear who's going to win in your congressional district, then find some other congressional district where it's not so clear and go to work. There's a couple of races in New Jersey that'll be key to deciding how the Congress comes out.
Up at the balcony?
And then there's one right down from here. Say again?
Should we go nuclear?
Should we go nuclear?
Should we go nuclear? Well, why not? My guess is that, Michael, you may have a different, my guess is that nuclear power is not going to play a huge role going forward for the simple reason that it's unbelievably expensive. I told you before that the price of a solar panel had dropped 90% over the last decade. The price of a nuclear power plant just keeps going up and up and up and up. It's like burning $20 bills to generate electricity. So I could be wrong about this, and there are people who think differently, and people who I respect. Jim Hansen, for instance, who's been one of my oldest, most treasured colleagues, is physicist and a big believer in nuclear power, and he keeps saying that we're on the edge of kind of fourth-generation nuclear power plants that'll be small and cheap and safe and so on. And as those emerge, it may change the equation. My guess is that most of the action over the next period of time is with renewable energy. That's where the trajectory is coming now. And I think probably that's in part because the world, whether it knows it or not, is kind of wants to go to a much more decentralized energy system than the one we've had in the past. A system that in energy mimics the way that we now move information around the web, say. My guess is that's where we're going. That seems to be the trend in most places around the world, but we'll see.
Well said. Last question. There was one.
Right down here, there was a young woman, I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, so the way that you talk about global warming, of course it's a really big issue, but it seems like only the government and like really big forces can help to overcome it. But what are some ways that each individual person at home can do to help address the issue?
Let me ask a question. How old are you?
11.
Okay. So in many ways, at least this fall, the most important global warming activist in the world right now is a 15-year-old girl in Sweden, Greta Thunberg. 15 years old. Now, I'm not going to suggest you do this because I don't want to get in trouble with your parents, okay? But she did something, have you been following this story? She did something quite remarkable in Stockholm. She announced in the summer, she said, if our leaders don't care about our future, why should I? I'm not going to school. And she sat down in a chair outside the, whatever they call the Congress in Stockholm, in Sweden. And she's become a kind of rallying point for renewed climate movement across Scandinavia. Over the weekend, she was speaking in Finland to crowds of many, many thousands of people. And so what she illustrates to me is that on the one hand, people who seemingly have not much power in our society, girls, in fact can play an enormous role in making things change, but that probably the best way to do that is not to try to look for individual things to do in your home. I trust you're doing most of those things now, that you've changed your light bulbs, that you've installed solar panels on the roof, that the sort of obvious things that you need to be doing. Those are really good and really important, and you cannot make the math of climate change add up at this point, doing them one by one. We don't have that kind of time. So we need people doing, not only leading these fights, but joining these fights just as importantly, because there's all kinds of people who are engaged in this work, and you need to try and find them and help them and join in with them. And there's absolutely no age limit on making that happen. Just the opposite. People will pay a great deal of attention to you. And the reason they'll do it is because they'll understand that this is an issue far more, look around this room. Most of us are, how to say this politely? Most of us are going to be dead before the absolute worst stuff that we're talking about comes to pass, but you are not. And we all know that. We all know that it's the prime of your life that we're talking about. And so you will be listened to, and listened to powerfully as you think of ways to speak out. Thank you for speaking out today. It's a good, for you, should be a good sort of reminder of the power that you possess. And we'll look forward to following along behind you as you do good things in the time ahead. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, brother. Great to have you here.
Well done.